Judge, let's be adults about this. You rule in my favor, I make sure this courthouse gets its renovation funding. You make this difficult, and I make sure it doesn't. That's not a threat. That's how cities work. Those were the words that stopped every clock in my courtroom that Wednesday morning. They didn't come from someone desperate about a parking ticket. They didn't come from a defendant who didn't understand the room they were standing in. They came from the elected leader of this city, the man whose name was on every ribbon-cutting ceremony, every press release, every promise made to the people of this community. And he said them to my face, in my courtroom, before I had read a single page of the case file. I have sat in this chair for more than 30 years. I have had people scream at me, flatter me, lie to me with the calm confidence of people who have been lying successfully their entire lives. I have seen every variety of arrogance this room attracts, but I have never, not once in 3 decades, had a sitting mayor walk through those doors and attempt to purchase a judicial outcome before the first piece of evidence had been placed before this bench. That morning didn't just test my patience, it tested something more fundamental than patience. It tested the question that every courtroom in this country is built to answer. Does the law mean the same thing regardless of who is standing in front of it? If you believe the answer to that question should always be yes. If you believe that a 72-year-old woman who has opened her shop at 6 in the morning for 38 years deserves the same protection as anyone else who walks through that door, then you need to hear every word of what happened next. Hit that subscribe button right now because this story is going to spread and you do not want to come to it late. I was midway through the morning docket when he walked in. Mayor Conrad Briggs, 54 years old, bespoke charcoal suit, 2 aides behind him typing on phones, and a lawyer beside him wearing the expression of a man who has spent the morning apologizing for someone and expects to spend the afternoon doing the same. He didn't take a seat. He walked directly to the front of the room, dropped a folder on the prosecution table, checked his watch, and informed me, using a familiarity he had not earned, that this matter should take 15 minutes and that I should consider the city's broader interests when reviewing the evidence. I removed my glasses and set them on the bench. On the other side of the aisle, in a chair she was sitting in very straight, was Nora Pham, 72 years old. A cardigan she had worn to every important occasion of her adult life, hands folded in her lap. She was looking at the bench with the composed, careful expression of someone who is frightened and has decided that showing it would cost her something she cannot afford to lose. She had run Nora's alterations on the same corner of the same street for 38 years. 7 violations had been filed against her shop in the previous 10 days, and the man who had just checked his watch while standing in my courtroom was the reason every single one of them existed. I called the case and the bailiff read the docket. Nora Pham stood up immediately, quietly, carefully, with the particular deliberateness of someone whose knees have developed strong opinions about cold mornings and plastic chairs. She stood the way people stand when they have been taught that standing for the court means something, and she waited. Mayor Briggs did not stand. He leaned back in his chair, crossed one leg over the other, and looked at me with the relaxed expression of a man attending a meeting he has already decided the outcome of. He used my first name, not Your Honor, not a title, not any of the forms of address that this room requires, and that every other person who has ever sat in that chair has managed to produce without instruction. This should take 15 minutes, he said. I'd appreciate it if we kept it moving. I have a press conference at noon. I did not respond immediately. I removed my glasses, set them on the bench with the deliberateness that communicates more than raising my voice ever could, and waited. 6 seconds. 8. Briggs's lawyer leaned over and whispered something urgent and close to his ear. The whisper of a man who has been managing this particular personality long enough to know exactly how this moment tends to go and has no remaining tools to prevent it. Briggs stood, slowly, with the theatrical reluctance of a man performing inconvenience for an audience he has decided owes him the performance. He straightened his jacket and looked at me with the minimal engagement of someone complying under protest. Mayor Conrad Briggs, complainant. I'm here to make sure this court finally does what the city's code enforcement office has been trying to accomplish for the past 10 days. He turned slightly toward Nora, not quite pointing, but orienting toward her in the dismissive way you orient toward something you want removed. That business is a nuisance on a key development corridor, and I'm here to see it handled properly. The gallery did not move, not a shuffle, not a whisper. The courtroom camera's red light blinked steadily in the back of the room. The mayor thought he had walked into a formality. He was about to find out what he had actually walked into. Briggs slid the folder across the table with the flat confidence of a man presenting something he considers self-explanatory. I opened it and read each violation carefully, not for the conclusion someone wanted me to reach, but for what the documents actually said when you removed the official language and looked at what was underneath. Violation 1, freight awning. No structural assessment attached, no engineering report, no measurement of deterioration, just the word frayed on a form with a checkbox next to it. Violation 2, signage exceeding permitted dimensions by 2 inches, measured by whom was not specified, using what instrument was not specified. Violations 3 through 6, pedestrian obstruction and general maintenance concerns, each citing anonymous complaints, 4 of them submitted within the same 48-hour window by people whose names appeared nowhere in the record. I looked up. Mr. Calloway. The city's code inspector had been sitting in the third row attempting the specific kind of stillness that people attempt when they are hoping not to be called upon. He was not successful. Did you personally observe each of the violations listed in this file? He stood and said, "Yes, Your Honor," with the flat delivery of a man reciting something he has been told to say rather than something he remembers doing. The awning, I said. Did you assess it as a structural risk, or did you assess it as visually worn? A pause longer than the question required. Visually worn, he said. And the sign, what instrument did you use to measure the 2-inch discrepancy? A longer pause. He described a process involving a measuring tape and an estimate. Can you name a single identified complainant from the 4 anonymous submissions? He could not. I closed the folder. The gallery had been silent since Briggs walked in, but this was a different quality of silence now. The silence of people who have just watched something that looked like documentation become something that looked like nothing. One question at a time. Then Briggs leaned forward and said, with the impatience of a man who has run out of interest in procedure, "The investors cannot wait. That's the reality of what we're dealing with here." The room went very still, and I thought, there it is. I set the folder down. The investors cannot wait. I had been in this room for 30 years, and I knew exactly what those 4 words meant when a mayor said them in the context of a 72-year-old woman's business license. They meant the citations were not about the awning. They meant that a development deal existed, that a corner was needed, and that the machinery of municipal code enforcement had been pointed at Nora Pham's shop like a tool selected for a specific job. I turned to Nora. "Ms. Pham, in the 38 years you have operated Nora's alterations on that corner, how many complaints or citations did you receive before this 10-day period?" Nora's voice, when it came, was quiet and completely steady, the steadiness of someone who has been frightened and has decided that showing it would cost her something she cannot afford to lose. "None, Your Honor. Not one. I open at 6 in the morning and I close when the last customer is finished. I have never once been cited for anything, not in 38 years. The gallery absorbed that in silence. I looked at Mayor Briggs. "Mayor Briggs," I said, keeping my voice exactly where I keep it when the question I'm about to ask is the only one that matters. If this shop belonged to your mother, if she had spent 38 years on that corner opening at 6 in the morning, never once receiving a citation, would you have sent an inspector? He opened his mouth. I watched him search for something that would answer the question without answering it. Nothing came. The silence stretched across the courtroom and filled every corner of it. In the back of the room, the courtroom camera's red light blinked steadily, recording everything. The silence was still sitting in the room when the courtroom doors opened. A man I did not recognize walked in, mid-40s, dark jacket, carrying a manila folder thick enough to suggest he had not assembled it quickly or casually. He moved with the purposefulness of someone who has spent time deciding whether to do something and has finally decided. He approached the clerk's desk, identified himself quietly, and asked to be recognized by the court. "Your name and your relation to this matter," I said. "David Reyes, Your Honor. I own the print shop at 414 Clement Street, 2 doors from Nora's alterations. I am a former city planning analyst. I have documentation I believe is relevant to these proceedings." He held up the folder. "I submitted public records requests last week. These are the responses." I looked at Briggs. Something had shifted in his posture. Not dramatically, not yet, but in the small, specific way that posture shifts when a person recognizes something they did not expect to see in a room they believed they had controlled. I admitted David Reyes and asked him to present his documentation. He opened the folder with the methodical calm of a man who has worked with public documents long enough to know that the facts inside them do not require embellishment. The development deal between the city and Hargrove Capital Group had been signed 11 days before the first citation was filed against Nora's alterations. 11 days. The inspector who had filed 6 of the 7 violations had been transferred to Nora's district the same week the development announcement was made. A transfer that was not requested by the inspector and had no documented operational justification. And there were emails. Internal city emails bearing the header of the mayor's office directed to the division chief of code enforcement, instructing the division to document compliance issues on the specific block, not the corridor, not the district, the block. David Reyes had brought these findings to the city planning office 3 days earlier. He was told the matter was outside his scope. He came to my courtroom instead. I noted for the record that he had made the correct decision. I admitted the documentation into the record, noted David Reyes's testimony for the proceedings, and began writing the order. That was when Mayor Briggs stood up, without being recognized, without waiting for a pause, without any of the procedural courtesies that every other person in that room had managed without instruction. He used the words judicial overreach. He used politically motivated and procedural abuse and the legitimate development interests of this city's future. He pointed at David Reyes, at the folder, at me, with the specific aggression of someone who has spent a career in rooms where pointing worked. I let him finish every sentence because the complete version is almost always more useful than the interrupted one. When he stopped, I looked at him. "Your outburst is noted for the record," I said. Then I turned back to the order and continued writing it. I dismissed all 7 violations, each one individually on procedural and substantive grounds, with the specific deficiency of each citation noted in the record. I reinstated Nora Pham's business license effective immediately. I ordered all 7 citations expunged from her business record. I referred the code enforcement process to the city ombudsman for review of potential abuse of process, and I referred the development documentation to the state attorney general's office for independent review. I signed the order and set down my pen. Mayor Briggs's face had gone a shade of red that his tailor had not considered when selecting the tie that morning. Gerald Pratt had spent the morning trying to occupy as little space as possible. A challenging ambition for a man being paid what he was being paid, but one he had pursued with genuine commitment. He had not spoken when Briggs interrupted. He had not spoken when the emails were admitted. He chose this moment. He rose and produced a document, 3 pages, city letterhead, the formal layout of a legal opinion, informing the court that the city's legal division had determined that a municipal judge's authority to refer evidentiary matters to the state attorney general's office was subject to prior city council approval. He placed it on the clerk's desk with the careful movement of a man hoping the gesture reads as confidence. I took the document. I read it. Then I looked at Gerald Pratt over my glasses. "Mr. Pratt, who authored this opinion?" He gave me a name from the city legal division. "When was it filed with the city legal office?" "It had been prepared," he said, "in anticipation of today's proceedings. Can you provide the filing reference number?" A pause. He could not. "Does this opinion appear in any public legal record of the city?" Another pause. Longer. It did not. A document prepared in anticipation of today's proceedings, authored by someone in an office controlled by the mayor, bearing no filing reference, appearing in no public record, produced at the precise moment the proceedings moved against the mayor's interests. I cited Mayor Conrad Briggs for direct contempt of court, the unrecognized outburst, the attempt to intimidate the proceedings, and the submission of a document whose authenticity could not be established and whose provenance raised questions the court was not prepared to leave unaddressed. 5 days in a county facility, a summary judgment executable immediately, not subject to vacation without a full appeal process. The appeal process, I noted for the record, takes approximately 5 days. Briggs stared at me. For one moment, everything, the performed confidence, the checked watch, the bespoke suit, was simply gone. What was underneath it was not what he had planned to show this courtroom today. The bailiff moved. Briggs was remanded. The story did not end when the gavel came down. The The courtroom footage was on the evening news before I had finished signing the remaining orders from that morning's docket. David Reyes's documentation reached the Attorney General's office by the following morning. The development deal, the timeline, the emails, the inspector's transfer became the lead story on every local broadcast by the end of the week. The city, which had been watching, began to understand what had almost been done on its behalf and in its name. 5 days later, the courtroom gallery was packed again, not with press this time, but with people, shop owners from the development corridor, neighbors, several people who later came forward to say that anonymous complaints had been submitted in their names without their knowledge or consent. Nora Pham was in the front row in the same cardigan. David Reyes sat beside her. The side door opened. Mayor Conrad Briggs walked in wearing a county-issued gray jumpsuit. No aides, no Pratt. He sent a junior associate who sat in the back row and said nothing. Briggs hadn't shaved in 5 days. He walked to the table and stood there, and for the first time since he had arrived in this courtroom a week ago, he looked directly at Nora Pham, not through her, not past her, but at her. He told her he looked at her shop and saw a corner. He told her he didn't see the 38 years, or the cardigan, or the woman who had built something with her hands and kept it open through everything. He said he was sorry, not in the practiced cadence of a politician managing a story, but haltingly, in the broken way of a man who has spent 5 days without his phone and his staff and his title and has run out of ways to make what he did sound like something else. Nora looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded, once quietly, without words and without forgiveness, the acknowledgement of one human being who has decided to see another. Briggs was transferred to state investigators to face charges of abuse of office, procurement fraud, and interference with a civil proceeding. At the courtroom door, he stopped and looked back. "I forgot what the job was supposed to be," he said quietly. Then he was gone. Nora and David walked out together. The shop opened at 6 the next morning, the way it always had. I want to say something directly to everyone watching this because I have thought about that morning many times and I think it deserves to be said plainly. This is not a story about hating the powerful or resenting ambition or opposing development. Cities grow. Corners change. That is not the issue. The issue is the instrument. The issue is what happens when the machinery of a city, its inspectors, its code enforcement division, its legal office, is redirected away from its actual purpose and pointed at a 72-year-old woman's awning because a developer needs her corner and a mayor needs the developer's support. The issue is what we decide that machinery is for. Nora Pham opened her shop at 6 in the morning for 38 years. She never received a citation. She never asked this courtroom for anything except to be subject to the same law as everyone else. That is not a special request. That is the only request this bench exists to honor. If this story moved you, if it made you believe even for a moment that the law can still mean the same thing regardless of who is standing in front of it, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel. Let's build something that believes accountability is not optional and that the woman in the cardigan deserves exactly what the man in the bespoke suit receives. The same law, applied the same way, in the same room. I have sat in this chair for more than 30 years. I will be here tomorrow. The law will be here with me. Nobody, not a developer, not an attorney with a document that doesn't exist in any public record, and not a mayor with a renovation budget to threaten people with, is above it. Not in this courtroom, not in this life.